Hello again everybody, hope you're all doing good. So we're back on the subject of variators in this video. We're going to be talking about the differences between a performance or sports variator and stock variator. So in my previous video on the subject of variators, I spoke about variator roller weights and how they don't necessarily affect acceleration and top speed directly, but rather they affect the speed at which the variator holds the engine at, because how these transmissions work is they let the engine rev up to a set RPM, hold it there, and then change the gearing around that RPM until they get to the highest possible ratio, and then the engine revs higher until you basically run out of revs. So obviously the weight of your roller is going to dictate what RPM the engine is held at. The idea being you want to get the correct weights so that the RPM your engine is held at is the RPM where it has peak torque. Then you're going to get the best possible acceleration and performance, and that's basically it. As you change to different parts, sports exhausts, sports cylinders, they will produce peak torque at a different RPM to stock, so you need to change your roller weights to accommodate that. But yeah, it's not necessarily to do with lighter is faster acceleration and heavier is more top speed. That's not the case. It's actually what I've just said. So with that out of the way, we're now going to talk about the actual basket itself. This is the actual variator basket, and why you may want to go for a sports or performance version. So when the manufacturers create the factory scooters and the factory variators, there's a couple of things that they have to take into consideration, and one of the biggest things that they are thinking about is meeting emissions and meeting speed restrictions. So one of the things they're going to do to try and meet emissions is, if you take a look at the ramps inside here, hopefully you can see on the video, this is a stock variator, and the ramps are pretty steep, and you'll also notice on this particular variator they stop quite soon, like they're really short but very steep ramps, and then they end sort of here. So by having a steeper ramp, what's going to happen is the rollers are basically going to travel up it. The best way to describe it is it's a more sudden and more harsh change of gear ratio. I'll give an example in a little bit of how exactly that works compared to a performance variator, but it's like basically changing up from first to third straight away. Like you're changing up the gears as quickly as possible, as harshly as possible, which is not great for performance, and it's not great for the smooth running either. But what it is good for is emissions, because the faster you can get into a higher gear ratio, the less emissions you're going to be kicking out, and that's basically one of the ways they get around that. So then another thing that they can sometimes do is, again, looking at these ramps, they're so short and they end so early. It's possible this particular clutch is also restricting top speed a little bit because the rollers aren't pushing the variator that far out. Now, some models of bike, the variators from the factory are a little bit better designed, and sometimes top speed isn't actually being restricted, but you do 9 times out of 10 usually have this steep ramp angle, which is again there to help with emissions and stuff like that, not necessarily performance. So what's the difference then between this and a performance variator? What are the things that a aftermarket manufacturer can do to improve this design? There's actually 5 things. So the first thing is actually the size of the rollers themselves. So these factory rollers are actually, if I remember rightly, well, they 12 by, I can't remember now, 12 by something. So an aftermarket variator will typically have larger rollers. So in the case of this scooter, the aftermarket variator has 16 by 13, which isn't a huge jump in size, but it's still bigger. Now, what that's going to do is help with longevity. So bigger rollers tend to wear out slower. So there's going to be a longer time between you having to replace them. So that's the first thing they can do. Second thing they can do, it actually has to do with this. This is the centre part of the variator. And one of the things they sometimes do is actually make this slightly shorter. Now, this particular one is already quite short, so I'm guessing the aftermarket one probably wouldn't be any shorter, but sometimes they do. And what will happen in that case is this will be shorter, but they will provide in the kit a washer which sits behind the variator and pushes the whole assembly out slightly. Now, just be careful, if you do buy an aftermarket variator, make sure you have a look at what comes with it, have a look at any instructions that come with it, and if they say to install a washer behind this, do so. It's not a restricting washer, it's not going to hurt performance. If anything, if you don't install it, it will hurt performance. So if they say to install the washer, just do it. So that's that. So that would then push the whole assembly out a bit, which would then push harder on the belt, which would theoretically change the way the belt travels up and down the variator. So next thing, on the subject of the belt travelling up and down, the next thing they can adjust is the curvature of this drive face. So obviously by adjusting how aggressive this is, or how non-aggressive it is, you will effectively change the characteristics of the way the belt travels up it. You'll either make it smoother or harsher or whatever, depending on what you're trying to achieve. The next thing is the actual diameter of the variator. So sometimes you can get what's known as overrange or overspeed or high speed variators, which will be slightly bigger in diameter, which again are designed to push the belt up further and therefore increase the gearing and increase your speed. And the last thing, as I've already sort of mentioned a little bit, is the actual ramps themselves. So typically in a sports variator, what you'll find is the ramps will be at a much, maybe not much, but they'll certainly be at a less severe angle. They'll be a bit more gradual. And a lot of the times they'll also come up higher. So where this variator, you've got these massive like stop bits basically, on a performance version, the ramp will actually come up closer to the top. So what that does, by having a shallower ramp, it basically smooths out the transition. So the best way I can describe this, and it's not exactly the same, but it's the best way to describe it, is imagine you've got a car with 4 gears, right? Because it's only got 4 gears, the difference between each gear is going to be quite big. So when you go from first to second, it's quite a jump, quite a severe jump, and then second to third, another severe jump. Now let's imagine we take the same car and we add 6 gears. Now, top gear isn't going to change, it's always going to be the same ratio, but because we've added more gears, we've now got more gears in between, so the difference between each gear is less, therefore the transition is a bit smoother, it's less harsh and whatever else. So that's exactly what's happening here. By going for a less steep ramp, it basically is the equivalent of adding more gears in between. As I say, it's not quite how it works because variators technically have an infinite number of gears because of the way they work, but it has the same effect. It basically smooths out the transition because the transition isn't going up a harsh, steep slope. It's going up a more gradual slope, so it's going to be a more gradual, smoother transition between the bottom and the top. The next thing, as I say, or as I have said, is that the ramps will typically go up a little bit higher as well. This will help to push the variator out further and make sure that the belt is getting to the highest possible point, giving you the highest possible final drive gear and helping with your speed. So with all that said, should you buy an aftermarket variator? Well, the answer to that really is yes. Pretty much most, if not all, scooters will definitely benefit from the first thing that I mentioned, which is the smoothing out of the transition between the lower and higher gear ratios. Now, that's especially going to be noticeable around town at slower speeds and things like that, where you're basically constantly going through and changing the gear ratio. So that's going to help smooth out your riding around town and just in general. The second thing is going to be a little bit of gain in top speed. Now, this one, like I say, the first thing, the smoothness, is going to pretty much work with all scooters, and you will probably also notice a better acceleration. Top speed wise though, some models of scooter definitely do gain top speed, anywhere between 5 and 10 miles an hour sometimes. Other models don't gain any top speed at all. It really depends on how the original variator was designed. Typically, like 125s and larger CC scooters probably won't see much in the way of top speed. In those cases, you're going to be gaining more in the way of acceleration and smoothness. 50cc's, you may see more in the way of top speed gain, just because if, like mine, you have this kind of thing going on, then obviously the higher ramps are going to push it out further, and that may help. So obviously it depends on your model and everything else, but definitely you will get a better, smoother acceleration and general driving around, especially around town. The only thing I will also say is, if you're going to go for a sports variator, if you've already adjusted the roller weights in your stock variator to get the perfect RPM whilst variating, you are more than likely going to have to adjust that again if you go for a different variator. The reason for that is because if you have shallower ramps, it's actually easier for the rollers to go up them. Think of it like if you're cycling up a hill. Far easier to cycle up a shallow hill than it is a steep hill. So you are going to have to adjust your weights again to bring your RPM back to exactly where you want it to be. Probably not a huge amount, I would say. Depending on how much difference there is in the ramps, you might need to go just a tiny bit lighter than you currently have, just to compensate for that. But otherwise, that's all you need to do. Great thing about variators is they are pretty much a bolt-on and go part. You don't need to adjust the fueling or anything like that. A lot of times, if you change anything else on the bike, like you change your piston and cylinder, you change your exhaust, anything like that, airbox, whatever, any adjustments you make there, you are going to have to make adjustments to your fueling to compensate. With a variator, you don't have to adjust anything. You can take a totally stock bike, put a sports variator on it, and you will notice a improvement in the way it rides without having to fiddle with anything else. It's literally bolt on and go part, apart from, as I say, slightly adjusting the roller weights to suit. But other than that, it's a pretty, I would say, good value for money modification, because I've known people who have, back when I was at college, I knew guys who had loads of scooters, and there would be like a couple of guys who had sports exhausts and stuff like that, and then a couple of guys who literally just had a variator, performance variator, and nothing else. And I tell you what, the guys who had the performance variators with totally stock bikes were faster than the guys who had performance exhausts. That may have also had something to do with the fact the guys with the performance exhausts probably didn't jet the bikes properly to compensate. But either way, this is definitely, well, not this is a stock one, but a performance variator is definitely the probably best value for money first modification you can do if you're just looking for that little bit of improvement without spending hours in the garage fiddling around with the carb jetting and all that kind of stuff. So there you go, guys. Hopefully that gave you a good idea of what you can expect from a performance variator upgrade. If you did enjoy this video, please do give it a like. If you haven't already, go check out my other videos. If you haven't seen the one about variator roller weights, go check that out. It's I think it's a pretty well detailed video explaining, exactly what you're looking to achieve when you do change your weights. So yep, go check that out. Obviously, if you haven't already, do subscribe to the channel, and I'll catch you again soon.